Sit for a moment and try to hold two numbers in your head at once. Say them to yourself, a phone number and the time you need to leave the house. Now notice something strange. You can only really attend to one of them at a time, flicking between them like a torch beam swinging across a dark room. That torch beam, and the speed at which it swings, is what people are actually describing when they say their thinking has slowed down. It isn't memory. It isn't intelligence. It's the switching speed of a specific attention circuit, and after a certain point in life, almost nobody trains it anymore. But here's the part that unsettles me the more I look at it. The circuit doesn't slow because it wears out. It slows because it stops being asked to do the one thing that keeps it fast. And the request itself, the demand, is what most lives quietly stop making somewhere in the sixth decade. So the real question isn't how to speed your mind up. It's why the mind lets go of a capacity it still physically has, and whether slower is even the right word for what's happening. Let me name the circuit because vagueness helps nobody here. There's a network in your brain called the frontoparietal control network. The coordination between your prefrontal cortex, sitting just behind your forehead, and your parietal lobes, up and toward the back of the skull. Neuroscientists sometimes call it the central executive. Think of it as the air traffic controller of the mind. It doesn't fly any of the planes, it decides which plane lands now, which one circles, and how fast the tower can move its attention from one runway to the next. When you talk about mental speed, you are almost always talking about how fast that controller can reassign the beam. So why does it feel slower with age? The easy answer, the one you've heard, is that neurons die and everything degrades. And there's truth in it, but it's the lazy truth, and it leads people to the wrong conclusion. Because the raw hardware loss is far smaller than the felt slowdown. A brain at 70 has lost only a modest fraction of its neurons in most healthy people. Yet the felt drop in switching speed is far larger than that loss can explain. Something else is doing most of the work, and it isn't decay. Here's the thing that took me a while to accept. Most of the slowdown is a change in what the controller chooses to do, not what it's able to do. Given a task that genuinely demands fast switching, and I mean genuinely, not a crossword you already know how to solve, an older brain can often reach speeds close to its younger self, just with more effort and more warning. The capacity is sitting there. The habit of using it hard is what's gone. And a capacity you stop demanding doesn't announce its departure. It just quietly stops showing up when you don't call it. Which raises a harder question. If the circuit still works, why does it feel so different from the inside? Why does switching between two thoughts at 65 feel like waiting when at 35 it felt like nothing at all? Part of the answer lives in a measurement called the P300. In the 1960s, researchers recording electrical activity from the scalp noticed a specific wave that appears roughly 300 milliseconds after your brain registers something meaningful and decides to reallocate attention to it. Around 0.3 of a second, that's the controller turning its head. And across large samples, that wave arrives later with each passing decade, drifting by very roughly a millisecond or two per year in many studies. Latency creeps. The tower still turns to look. It just takes a beat longer to swing, and a beat longer, compounded across 1,000 tiny switches an hour, is exactly what I've lost a step feels like from the inside. Now, I want to be honest about that number, because I keep seeing it inflated. You'll find people online claiming reaction time collapses by huge percentages after 60, sometimes doubling. That is not what the careful data shows. Simple reaction time, see a light, press a button, barely moves across healthy adult life, changing by a small fraction. It's only when you stack a decision inside the task, a choice between responses, that the age gap opens up meaningfully. So the slowdown is real, but it's specific. It lives in the choosing, not the reacting. Anyone selling you the doubling number is selling fear, and fear is the wrong fuel for this. So if the choosing is where it lives, what makes the choosing slow? Here's a physical way to hold it. Imagine a railway junction with a set of switches. Every time a train needs to change lines, someone has to throw a switch, and there's a small cost each time. The switch has to seat, the signal has to clear. Your brain has exactly this cost, and psychologists have a name for it. Switch cost, the extra time it takes to do a task right after you were doing a different one, compared to repeating the same task. In a young brain, the switch throws fast and cleanly. In an untrained older brain, the switch still throws, but it drags, and sometimes it leaves a little of the old track's setting behind. That residue, That ghost of the previous task bleeding into the next one has its own name. Task set inertia. The old setting doesn't fully clear before the new one loads. If you've ever walked into a room, forgotten why, and stood there while the previous thought kept running in the background, that's task set inertia made visible. The controller threw the switch, but the old track was still warm. You've felt this 1,000 times and probably filed it under getting older. It isn't age, it's an untrained switch with residue on it. And this is where I have to complicate the whole picture, because I don't think slower is honest. Watch what an older brain actually does when it works, using functional MRI, and you don't see a dimmer version of a young brain. You see a differently organized one. There's a well-documented pattern researchers named Harold, hemispheric asymmetry reduction in older adults. In plain terms, a young brain doing a hard attention task lights up mostly one side of the prefrontal cortex. An older brain doing the same task lights up both. It recruits the other side of the room to help carry the load. So is that decline or is that adaptation? This is genuinely disputed, and I'm not going to pretend the field has settled it. One camp reads the extra recruitment as compensation, the brain drafting reserves to keep performance up, and often it does keep performance up. Another camp reads it as dedifferentiation, circuits that used to be specialized becoming muddier, less precise, firing together when they should fire apart. Depending on which paper you're holding, the same two-sided glow is either the brain fighting well or the brain losing its edges. The truth, as far as I can tell, sits in between. It's compensation when the circuit is still being challenged, and it slides toward mush when it isn't, which puts the demand, the challenge, right back at the center of everything. Stay with that idea because it's the hinge of the whole thing. If the difference between recruiting reserves brilliantly and smearing into noise is whether the circuit is still being asked hard questions, then mental speed at 70 is not primarily a medical fact. It's closer to an ecological one. A path through a forest stays a path only because feet keep pressing it. Stop walking it, and the forest doesn't leave a paved road behind out of respect for how important the path once was. It sends in the low growth first, then the saplings, and within a few seasons the root is still technically there but slow to travel, snagging you at every step. The neural version of that undergrowth is the residue on the switch, the beat added to the P300, the smear across both hemispheres. Not destruction. Encroachment. If that reframed something for you, and there's a stranger layer coming, one that turns this whole question inward in a way I didn't expect, subscribe now, because that turn is only a few minutes away and it's the reason I sat down to make this at all. So what stops pressing the path? Why does the demand fall away right around the 6th decade so reliably that we mistake the schedule for biology? Look honestly at what a demanding day used to contain. Novel problems with no template, interruptions you couldn't control, forcing hard switches on someone else's timing, names and faces you had to load fast under social pressure, new tools you didn't want to learn but had to. Each of those is a rep for the frontoparietal controller, an unplanned, unwelcome, genuinely difficult switch. And a life that has earned its calm sensibly tends to shed exactly those. The environment gets predictable. The switches become optional. The path stops getting walked not through any failing, but through the quiet success of having arranged a life that no longer ambushes you. And here's the trap folded inside that comfort. The activities we reach for to keep the mind sharp are often the ones that demand the least switching. A crossword you're good at is mostly retrieval, pulling known words from storage which lives in a different system entirely and stays strong. Rereading a familiar kind of book is recognition, not reallocation. These feel like mental exercise because they involve the mind, but the controller barely turns its head. It's the difference between walking a route you know in your sleep and navigating a city you've never seen. Only one of them makes the junction throw its switch under load. Have you ever noticed that a genuinely new task, a card game with rules you don't know, a route through an unfamiliar town, a conversation in a language you half speak, leaves you tired in a way that a full day of familiar work never does? That specific fatigue is the controller working at full recruitment. You've felt exactly what training this circuit costs. Most people spend their lives avoiding that feeling. It turns out that feeling is the whole medicine. Now let me get concrete, because a principle you can't act on is just a nice sentence. The thing that trains the frontoparietal controller is not effort in general. It's forced, time switching between unlike tasks under a demand you can't fully predict. 3 features have to be present: And if any one is missing, the training thins out. The task has to be genuinely unfamiliar, or at least underpracticed. It has to force switches on a timing you don't set yourself. And it has to sit right at the edge where you make errors, because errors are the signal the circuit uses to sharpen. A task you never fail is a task the controller has already stopped attending to. Here is where the research gets specific and, I think, hopeful. There's a body of work on what's called process-based cognitive training, not learning facts, but repeatedly hammering the switching process itself. In several controlled studies, older adults trained on tasks that force rapid switching and updating showed measurable gains not just on the trained task, but in the underlying speed, with the P300 latency shortening back toward younger values in some samples. The junction, thrown hard and often for a few weeks, starts seeding faster again. I want to be careful here, because the question of how far those gains spread to everyday life, what researchers call transfer, is honestly contested, and anyone who tells you a brain game guarantees a sharper daily mind is overselling a real but narrower finding. The switch gets faster. Whether your whole life feels faster depends on whether you keep throwing switches in your whole life. So if you take nothing else, take this, and if it's new to you, it's worth marking. Once a day, put yourself in front of something that forces you to switch on a clock you don't control and lets you fail. Not a puzzle you're fluent in. Something with a live, unpredictable demand, a fast card game where the rules keep changing, a piece of music slightly beyond your hands where you must read ahead while playing behind, a conversation practiced in a language you're still clumsy in, a route walked somewhere you've never been with no map out, 10 to 15 minutes at the edge where you stumble. The stumbling is not the failure of the exercise. The stumbling is the exercise. If that single distinction, familiar retrieval versus forced switching, was new to you, hit like. It's the one signal that tells the algorithm to show this to someone else who's been playing the same crossword every morning and wondering why it isn't helping. But I promised a stranger layer, and this is where the ground shifts under the question itself. Everything so far treats mental speed as something you'd obviously want more of. Faster switching, sharper controller, quicker beam, and I believed that cleanly until I started reading about what the slowing might be doing. Because here's a fact that doesn't fit the story. On certain measures, older adults are better at some kinds of thinking, and the improvement seems to depend on the very slowing we've been trying to reverse. Consider what a fast, aggressive attention controller actually does. It filters hard. It grabs what's relevant to the task and slams the door on everything else, which is fantastic for speed and terrible for noticing the thing you weren't looking for. There's research, some of it from Lynn Hasher's group, suggesting older adults filter less aggressively, letting in more supposedly irrelevant information. In a narrow speed test, that looks like a deficit. The door won't stay shut. But give people a later task where that irrelevant information turns out to matter, and the older adults, who never fully filtered it out, sometimes outperform the young. The leaky filter caught something the sharp one threw away. So sit with the possibility I can't fully resolve. What if a portion of what we call mental slowing is the controller relaxing its grip on purpose, trading the narrow speed of a young beam for a wider, softer floodlight that takes longer to swing but illuminates more of the room at once? The young mind is a torch, bright, fast, and blind to everything outside the circle. The older mind may be drifting toward a lantern, dimmer at the center, slower to point, but casting light into the corners the torch never touched. We measure the swing speed and call the lantern broken. We never measure how much of the room it's holding. I don't want to make that too pretty, because the drift can also just be decline, and telling every slowing mind that it's secretly getting wiser would be its own kind of lie. Both are happening in proportions that differ from person to person, and I don't think anyone can yet cleanly separate the two from the inside. What I'm fairly sure of is this. The switching circuit, the controller, the fast beam, that specific system does respond to demand at any age, and letting it go unchallenged costs you something real in the currency of speed. And I'm equally sure that speed was never the whole of a mind, and that a life optimized only for how fast the beam swings would be a poorer life, not a sharper one. So maybe the honest instruction isn't get your speed back, maybe it's keep the switch capable of throwing fast, so that speed stays a choice you can make, and then spend most of your hours letting the lantern do what the torch never could. Train the circuit precisely so you're not forced into slowness, then choose, on purpose, when to be slow. Share this with someone you know who's been quietly grieving their own quickness, convinced it's gone for good. It isn't gone. It's untrained, and part of it may be turning into something they haven't learned to value yet. Here's the question I'll leave you holding, because I genuinely don't know the answer for myself. If you could throw the switch as fast as you did at 30, but only by giving up whatever the slowing has been quietly teaching you to notice, would you take the trade? Sit with that one before you answer. The fact that you have to think about it is, itself, the lantern.